before we got started today about the importance of cash flow. When we talk about small businesses, so many people talk about sales, right? And sales is part of cash flow. It's where we get our cash flow, but I don't think that people really understand what cash flow is. You'd think that it would mean how is cash is coming in, but I don't think that people realize how much is going out, or just the whole concept of it, right? Like, you see, like, yeah, it's flowing right by me, right? so how do you help people understand what cash flow is and why it is so important, especially in the SMB space? Welcome to the show, Tom. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Today's a wonderful day. How about you?
It's a good day here. It's not raining. It's been raining for the last few days here in Virginia. So I'm happy to see the sun out. Pool is now uncovered officially. So we're waiting for everything to decloud and get the sun out here this weekend,
That's
hopefully. So
fantastic.
where are
It's
you
a
calling in from?
first 80-degree day here in Chicago. So there's going to be a lot of
Chicago.
cold ones poured,
Wow.
and it's a great day.
Nice, nice. We just moved from Illinois. We were downstate from you in Springfield for about 4 years. And so we escaped we only get 6 weeks of that muggy, hot, humid Illinois summer weather now. So down here, you only get 6 weeks versus in the downstates. Like, I don't know how it is in Chicago because of the wind, but like good 4 months of just 90% humidity is like really tough. I was like, especially after living in Alaska for 17 years, I'm like, nah, I can't handle this.
That is brutal. That's not far from our family farm, and but I don't go there except outside the fall. So,
There
but
you
I
go.
feel for you.
Awesome. So we were talking in the green room before we got started today about the importance of cash flow, and that when we talk about small businesses, so many people talk about sales, right? And sales is part of cash flow. It's where we get our cash flow, but I don't think that people really understand what cash flow is, right? Because you'd think that it would mean how is is coming in, but I don't think that people realize how much is going out, or just the whole concept of it, right? Like, you see, like, yeah, it's flowing right by me, right? so
Yep.
so how do you help people understand the what cash flow is and why it is so important, especially in the SMB space?
Good question. Let's start at the top with the most important aspect, which is you want cash to reinvest into the business, and you want to invest it into things that produce a good ROI or return on investment for your business. And so we really help companies focus just on that. And we really talk about the tactical aspects of how can we take this cash and predictably reinvest it, and then know, 3 months down the line, how much should be coming back. And then
Hmm.
we can continue to reinvest in the business and help it grow. You get the team paid more, get the
Mhm.
owners higher
Mhm.
distributions, the things that everyone loves.
So the cash flow really, so when we say cash flow, we're talking about cash that we can hold on to, because we have the cost of goods, the cost of service, or cost of sales, if you will, COGS, that kind of thing. So you're talking about kind of, would you consider that like the gross profit, and holding on to a chunk of the gross profit is where cash flow actually is?
That's a good question. I would go a little bit further down the P&L and maybe even go to the elusive EBITDA type metric, which is more of the proxy for cash flow.
Okay.
And the reason being is we do need to think about those overhead costs. So it's a
Hmm.
great point. You have your gross profit that covers your either cost of service or your cost of goods if it's a hard product that you're selling. And then after that, you still have your team to pay
Hmm.
out. After that, that's really anything left over before those, the interest and the taxes and all that good stuff. That's what we want to take and say, hey, does it make sense to put this back into the business? or is there a better place to put it if there's an abundance of it, into your pocket and allocate it to, you know, various investments that might return you. But for the most part, I think small business owners, they look at their business and say, this is where 80% of my wealth is.
Mm-hmm.
I need to reinvest and continue to grow this thing because I haven't been saving in my 401k. I haven't been
Mm-hmm.
putting anything away into my traditional Roth IRA. What are we going to do
Mm-hmm.
here? And so I think most business owners, they've put their lives work into building this company, building this team, and building a wonderful culture that they want to continue, whether they have the opportunity to pass that down to their children or the team and the employees doing some sort of employee purchase of the company, or they monetize it a different way by potentially selling it and
Mm.
ultimately exiting.
Right. And I think that people don't realize is like when we're looking at our cash flow, we if you don't use it, so like you could have that EBITDA sitting there in your bank account at the end of the year. And the most of us, I mean, if we're an S corp, we're getting taxed on anything that is not spent at the end of the year. But we have to have cash on hand. And I think that a lot of people are like, well, I need to get down to zero so I don't have to pay any taxes. But then they have a couple of bad months, and it's like all of a sudden now you have to either borrow money, right, on a line of credit or your credit cards or whatever that looks like, and then now you're paying interest on that money there anyway, right? And so I think that's it's a I don't even call it a mistake, but maybe a misnomer that we as business owners do need to show that profit, especially if you're going to sell your company. You need to show as much of that. Now, obviously, we have ad backs and stuff like that to say, hey, if it's not me in there, I'm not paying myself, blah, 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 blah. But that EBITDA is the first number they look at. And if it's not very good, you're not going to get much for it because everybody bases, tell me if I'm wrong, we base all the value of our company in a service-based business by EBITDA, right?
Yep. And the blah blah that you had mentioned on those ad backs is a lot of what we see in this SMB, the small, medium-sized businesses, where a lot of the personal and professional runs together. You do
Right.
have that intertwine, you have people that put a lot of stuff on their personal credit. And I would ultimately try to encourage to keep those separate. And
100%.
we look for lines of credit if needed from banks that are reasonable, but make sure that there's an ability to pay down. I think a lot of people can get into the habit of borrowing, and then eventually that hole gets too deep and you're never going to get out of it. And
Oh, I
ultimately,
know that way too well.
and ultimately, you want someone to be watchful of that and just make sure that it's there for those moments that you're talking about. Exactly.
Mhm.
You want to spend the money and show the no profit. Of course, if you're reinvesting it in a smart way and limit your tax liability.
Mhm.
And ultimately, it's okay to pay taxes. If you have produced good profits and you don't have places to put it that makes sense in terms of reinvesting in the business, you can keep that cash on hand. You can do owner distributions. But ultimately, that working line of credit working capital effectively with the line of credit can really help bridge that gap that you're
Mhm.
talking about, where you run down the business at year end and then heading into that next year you have some wiggle room to tap into that line of credit and then pay it back.
Right.
And so
And
but it you kind of it can you can some people don't game it perfectly and then
right.
they get into trouble.
Right. No, I think that, I mean, for me, I remember, I was one of my businesses was a creative agency, and we were running millions of dollars through the company, and it was all flowing. It was not being redirected, but we also had a lot of debt, and we were told, back then that debt was good. Like, you need debt, dot, dot, dot. And I'm like, okay. And I believed him. And we grew at all costs, because that was this is in the 2000s, early 2000s. So, that was the .com era. That was the, unicorn VC kind of concept, but everybody was being told that grow at all costs. EBITDA wasn't you wanted top line growth. You wanted more employees, a bigger office. That was what showed the outside world that you were a successful business. Right. And of course, that was all facade, and it was all a house of cards, right? And eventually, to me, I was like, it's unsustainable. I mean, I could sit there and be in entrepreneur poverty for another 5 years and kind of restructure it, or I did what not too many people would do, is basically close the doors on a multi-million-dollar company to just basically rise from as a phoenix out of the ashes, with all of the smarts that I have now from the 13 years of living in entrepreneurial poverty. And I think that something you were talking about is like, it's okay to pay taxes. There was a time where I wanted to buy a house, and because I wasn't paying taxes, because I was playing that game, and obviously not timing it well, because we had debt because of those shortfalls that we would run into. They were like, well, you're not showing any profit, so we can't. That's how we decide whether you have money. Even though I was paying myself a W-2, they were looking at the business going, well, you're not showing any profit on that side, so you have a liability as a business, not an asset. And so I couldn't buy. I had to show that I was paying taxes for a couple of years before I could buy something. So I think a lot of people don't realize the importance of paying taxes sometimes.
It's very tough for getting a conventional loan for entrepreneurs. Just very hard when you're going to buy a home.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times, they won't even accept like real estate agents that are 1099 or have S corps, unless they have that salary, not the distributions, the salary, the W-2, the predictability of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. And going kind of back to your question with regards to, I think it was the kind of the investing side, taking on that debt and going through cycles during that time period, is really interesting, because the valuation and what the market thinks during one time period of an economic cycle, and what they want to value and how they tell you they're going to value you, is very different than when you go to exit.
Mm-hmm.
So it's okay. It's okay um, to effectively think about the business in the context of when am I going to exit, and investing and not showing lots of profit until you're really positioning to exit. So J curving the business, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
reinvesting in your growth. That's okay. What's not okay is taking a valuation, if you're taking on capital. This is, of course, equity, not
Mm-hmm.
debt, at a growth multiple. When the cycle ends up rolling over and you find yourself that you're trying to raise another round, and now you're in this cash flow cycle that's valued on EBITDA. So you might have been, you went in on revenue and it was a growth at all costs, but now you're coming out or looking to go back to the trough to get some additional capital. You're looking for food to, feed your people and stay alive, but it's not available, at least not at taking a huge, huge cut and haircut
Right.
on their
Right.
valuation, which a lot of time comes at the detriment of the common shareholders. And a lot of
Right.
founders, is getting a little too technical, but getting a lot of the founders, when they raise capital, they don't realize, or even angel investors, what participating preferred can really do to the common shareholders as it pertains to dilution. And we're
Mm-hmm.
talking like a whole just cram down recap of the cap table. It's not pretty. It's not fun.
Uh-uh.
And so I always encourage people to think about the business as, even if you are a startup or any type
Mm-hmm.
of company out there, is to consider thinking about it from the cash flow standpoint of, if we don't go and become a unicorn, how do we end up exiting this business and not end up in no man's land where there's no acquisition in sight, or at least that we can't monetize our exit and it's all for
Right.
nothing because we paid
Right.
ourselves a very below market salary. We thought that everything was going to be on the back end, and then we
Mm-hmm.
get crushed because the investors decided, we're only going to pay on EBITDA now. What's your cash flow? Well, it's zero. We've been reinvesting in the business.
Right. And then they look at the reinvestment. Well, where's my ROI? I look at VC capital, any type of capital, and somebody buys in for shares, all that stuff. I consider it debt. I have a friend who took on about $150,000 small venture capital in injection into his company to kind of launch this idea, and now he wants to exit. And the problem is that he didn't and most people don't become unicorns. I'm sure you can agree with me on that. So everybody who's like,
That's
well,
a
yeah, once
fact.
we get to, we get to $1 billion and all problems are solved at $1 billion or IPO or whatever you want to go off of. Right. And it's like, well, most people don't. 98% of all service-based businesses don't even get to $1 million. Right. And of those 2% who make it there, only 10% of those make it to $10 million. Right. Like the chances of people getting in there. So like as a small business that most of us are bootstrapping our bootstrapping our companies. Right. And we look at debt as something that we can manage, or we could get money from somebody who doesn't need it paid back, which helps in cash flow. But when you go to exit, you got to pay that money back with a multiple. And that's where my buddy came in and he's like, I've got to cover this $150,000 on the sale of my book of business. I was like, you're going to break even at best. When we looked at the numbers, because I've seen enough of these exits in a small space where, you only have $1 million company and they're thinking, well, I'll be able to get $4 million for it because it'll be a 4x multiple, not on revenue, on EBITDA. So maybe at 450,000, right? And they want a return on their investment. They're probably going to want 300,000 of that. So you're only going to have $150,000. Like that's
Yeah, just like those napkin ideas, napkin math is good sometimes too. And just
right.
really putting it down and showing, hey, look, there's some put and takes here, but ultimately just think about it. Stop and think about it. If you're not going to be truly looking for that big exit, you have the ability to truly scale this thing quickly, it's just not a good idea. But taking on debt comes with PG in it, personal guaranteeing, or going through the rigmarole of bankruptcy, which is never fun either. And I think it's important to address what you just said in terms of those service-based companies and talking about the valuations for the SMB community, the small, medium-sized business owners that are focused in on cash flow, owner distributions that are ultimately going to be how they're valued on that EBITDA proxy multiple. And so within that, those companies that don't get to 1 million, those multiples they get paid on, that you're going to do a Google search and you're going to find out, hey, these other companies are getting 5 times their money, not at $1 million or below. It's going to, you're lucky to get, 3, it might be 2. And
Mm.
so that percentage of the ones that get to the 10 million, that's why they're more valuable. There's just not many out there, and it's de-risked the entire investment for anyone that's looking to buy it, because that concentration risk of losing a client or customer competition comes in and takes away some customers is
Mm.
not as detrimental. You are still going to be able to service the debt, still reinvest in the business, might not be as profitable, might need to retool to kind of grow and get back, or, increase the valuation. But it's important to kind of have those things in mind as you're thinking about the debt and where we're going. So we focus a lot of times with our clients around those aspects.